Good morning, everyone. It's good to, well, I was going to say it's good to see you guys, but I can't see you. So, and it doesn't sound right to say it's good to be seen. So, I'm glad to know that you have joined me this morning. How's that? In our quest to learn more about the book of Job. This morning's lesson is called Miserable Comforters. Pastor Tom touched on this just a few weeks ago, probably about a month ago, in his Wednesday night lessons. So we're going to be looking at this. Last week we learned about a great debate that took place in heaven between God and Satan. The result of that debate was the misery of Job. A misery that didn't seem to have a reason, at least not to Job, although it did, and one that thankfully had a good conclusion for Job. So, after the events of last week's lesson, as we know, Job, who is now obviously suffering greatly, along come three friends of his to comfort him. Unfortunately for Job, these three friends would turn out to be miserable comforters. So we're going to begin in chapter 2, and we're going to be jumping around a lot this morning. So make sure you put on your seatbelts because the ride can be quite wild at times. And as usual, please keep your hands and your body inside the ride at all times. We're going to start with chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 11 through 13 to begin with. This is where Job's friends come to him, okay? In verse 11 of chapter 2 says, "Now when Job's three friends heard about all this adversity that had come upon him, they came, each one from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite." Remember, I struggle with these names. "And they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him." Now, as Pastor Tom touched on about a month ago, if that was all that they did in actuality, it would have really been wonderful for Job, just to come and sympathize and comfort. Unfortunately, that wasn't all that they did. All right, so what do we have so far? This passage introduces three friends of Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. These men came to Job in his hour of need. Now, their intended goal was good and noble. And as we just read in verse 11, they came to just simply to be with him, to share his sorrow, to mourn with him, and hopefully bring some relief to Job. Sometimes when someone is hurting that we might know, the very best thing that we can do is to just simply let them know that we're there with them, or to actually physically go and be with them. Sometimes when we know someone is hurting, we could learn from this lesson and just simply keep our mouths closed. Don't say a word. Just be there with them. All right. So we looked at verse 11. Now, in verse 12, when they looked from a distance, remember last week, you have to put this in context and remember what happened to Job, okay? So you have to kind of go back to remember that. So verse 12, when they looked from a distance, it says that they did not even recognize Job. It says they raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. This was a Eastern sign of mourning. And I don't mean mourning like as in the AM. I mean mourning as in sadness over somebody. You know, mourning is not necessarily sadness over somebody who died. In this case, it's sadness over somebody who was so ravaged with disease that it caused grief in those who saw him. The boils had left Job with a horrific, disfigured appearance. And upon seeing Job, his three friends were instantly gripped with grief and mourning as if one had died. We learned last week about the calamities that fell upon Job, the loss of his family, his fortune, his basically everything except for his life itself. But Job's physical body was left ravaged with boils, and he looked so horrible that when his friends saw him, they were in an absolute state of shock. Verse 13 says that then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. So far, so good. With no one speaking a word to him. For they saw that his pain was very great. So far, I can't find anything but good in what Job's 3 friends have done. Imagine they first saw him and they were horrified when they saw him because of his physical condition. Then they just sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights. They were just there with Job. And not one of them said a word. And they saw that his pain was great. If that was all that they did, it would have been fantastic. They would have been awesome comforters. But as our lesson is called, they were miserable comforters. And we're going to learn why. They shared in Job's afflicted state, acting as if they were similarly afflicted. They offered no statement except their compassionate presence. It's a shame that it didn't just end there. Later in Job, chapter 13, verse 5, Job himself would remark that he had wished that they had remained silent during their entire visit. Now, as I said earlier, we're going to be doing a lot of skipping around in order to focus on the conversations and their intended purpose and their actual impact on Job. We'll begin by jumping over to chapter 4, where we have the noble and illustrious Eliphaz. This, and I'm going to be a little cynical in this lesson this morning, so just bear with me. This gentleman's speech, see, I use the word gentleman, so I'm being cynical there, to Job is covered in its entirety in chapters 4 through 5, with Job responding to him in chapters 6 and 7. But for brevity's sake this morning, we're just going to focus on chapter 4, verses 1 through 8. Another thing we're going to look at, the conversations that we're going to look at this morning are just the first conversations that these 3 friends had with Job. And of course, Job's responses to them. There's a lot of other conversations. In fact, really the first 35 chapters of Job covers these responses, these speeches that they give him, and Job's responses to them. And I would encourage you to read the entire book. It's not all that long, and yeah, it's a little bit sad, a little bit depressing, but know this: in the end, it turns out good for Job. Okay, but just read the whole book. Look at these conversations. Look at all this in context. Look at the so-called comfort that these friends are attempting to bring to Job. And you'll see how short-sighted they are and how they just didn't hit the mark. All right, so we're going to start off with, we're going to look at chapters 4, verses 1 through 8, and Eliphaz. Okay, Eliphaz the Temanite responded. Now, he was from Teman, okay, that's why he's called a Temanite, an Edomite city that was known as the center of wisdom. We learn that in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 7, not about Eliphaz, but about the city. I say that because, it's interesting. This city was supposedly the center of wisdom, and yet the words that came out of the mouth of Eliphaz were anything but wisdom. Verse 1, Eliphaz the Temanite responded. Now verse 2, if one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? But who can refrain from speaking? Wow, such lofty words. Basically he's saying, Job, I just can't keep quiet any longer. He felt compelled to speak. Concern for Job strongly motivated him to try to help his suffering friend. Nevertheless, it's going to be found later on that the advice of Eliphaz and the rest of Job's counselors are so wrong. And we find that later on in Job chapter 42, verses 7 through 8. I'll let you look that up yourself. He began by recounting Job's obvious reputation for godliness and his history of being there for others. Remember, why did God allow Satan to test Job? Job was an upright and godly man, and there is no other found to be quite like him. So Job obviously did have a reputation for godliness and for teaching others and helping others. Verse 3, Eliphaz continues, "Behold, you have taught many, and you have strengthened weak hands." So far, so good. "Your words have helped the stumbling to stand, and you have strengthened feeble knees." Suddenly, the content of Eliphaz's speech turns into an indictment against Job and his condition. So look at verse 5. "But now it comes to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are horrified. Is your fear of God not your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? Remember how remember now, whoever perishes being innocent." I didn't say that right. What he is saying is, remember, those who perish are not the innocent. Or where were the upright destroyed? I find a little bit of fault with his theology, but obviously too, his motivation is just not quite in the right place. "According to what I have seen," Eliphaz says, "those who plow wrongdoing and those who sow trouble harvest it." Okay, so what's wrong with this speech? Well, to begin with, it didn't even come close to hitting the mark of comforting Job. Remember, these three friends came to comfort, and just by sitting with Job for 7 days and 7 nights and not saying a word, they were comforting him. And now they made the big mistake of opening their mouth. Obviously, not knowing anything about the debate that took place in heaven, Eliphaz wrongfully assumed that Job was suffering from some unknown or unconfessed sin. There's one positive factor in his speech. Dr. Robinson points out that of the three friends that began to dispel their knowledge and wisdom to Job, Eliphaz was at least somewhat diplomatic in his delivery. Wow, big plus. You really need to examine all the verses, especially the ones that we don't have time to cover this morning, because contained in these verses is more fruitful advice from Job's friends. But I'll just give you the summary. After listening to Eliphaz and Job interact, Bildad decided he needed to say some things in chapter 8. I'm just going to be reading the whole chapter in its entirety and then offer a brief summary afterwards, so stick around. Chapter 8, "Then Bildad the Shuhite responded, 'How long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a mighty wind?'" Oh, a little less diplomatic than Eliphaz. "Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert what is right? If your sons sinned against him, and he turned them over to the power of their wrongdoing. If you search for God and implore the compassion of the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely now he will stir himself for you and restore your righteous estate. Though your beginning was insignificant, yet your end will increase greatly. Please inquire of past generations and consider the things searched out by their fathers. For we are only of yesterday and know nothing, because our days on earth are as a shadow. Will they not teach you and tell you and bring forth words from their minds? Can papyrus grow tall without a marsh? Can the rushes grow without water? While it is still green and not cut down, and yet it withers before any other plant. So are the paths of all who forget God, and the hopes of all the godless will perish. His confidence is fragile, and his trust as a spider's web. He depends on his house, and it does not stand. He holds on to it, and it does not endure. He flourishes before the sun, and his shoots spread out over his garden. His roots wrap around a rock pile. He grasps a house of stones. If he is removed from his place, then it will deny him, saying, I never saw you. Behold, this is the joy of his way, and out of the dust others will spring. Behold, God will not reject a person of integrity, nor will he help evildoers. Yet he will fill your mouth with laughter, and your lips with joyful shouting. Those who hate you will be clothed with shame, and the tent of the wicked will no longer exist. Okay. What was wrong with Bildad's speech? To be quite blunt, his speech held a lot of truth. Problem is, it did not apply to Job's situation. Again, not knowing about the debate that took place in heaven, both Eliphaz and Bildad said a lot of words and filled the air with their words and their so-called wisdom. The problem is it had nothing applicable to Job. His speech was basically that he believed that God is always just. Okay, like I said, there's some truth in it. And so Job must be getting what he deserved. And there's where he missed the mark. He supported Eliphaz's suggestion that Job must have been harboring some dreadful sin. He simply took the ideas a little further and concluded that since God is just, and since God punishes sin, Job must have sinned. And again, the problem with his speech, Bildad's speech, was that it was the same with Eliphaz's. It misses the mark. It didn't help at all with Job and with his very unique situation. In chapter 9, Job does get to respond to Bildad. Again, please read these chapters that we're skipping. There's a lot of good information in there. In chapter 11, we now have Zophar's turn at the microphone. Sorry about that. As with Bildad's speech, I'm just going to read the entire chapter again and then offer a few comments afterward. Then Zophar, and I have trouble with this word, the Naamathite, responded, Shall a multitude of words go unanswered, and a talkative man be acquitted? Shall your boast silence people? And will you scoff and have no rebuke? For you have said, My teaching is pure, and I am innocent in your eyes. Now again, just with Bildad's speech, Zophar's speech contains nuggets of truth, but the same problem exists. It misses the mark. Okay, verse 4. For you have said, My teaching is pure, and I am innocent in your eyes. But if only God would speak and open his lips against you, and show you the secrets of wisdom. For sound wisdom has two sides, Job. Know then that God forgets part of your guilt. Can you discover the depths of God? And can you discover the limits of the Almighty? They are as high as the heavens. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you do? What can you know? Its measurements is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If he passes by or apprehends people or calls an assembly, who can restrain him? For he knows false people, and he sees injustice without investigating. An idiot becomes intelligent, and a wild donkey born a human. If you would direct your head rightly and spread out your hands to him, if wrongdoing is in your hand, put it far away, and let not malice dwell in your tents. Then indeed, you could lift up your voice without moral blemish, and you would be firmly established, not fear. For you would forget your trouble. Like waters that have passed by, you would remember it. Your life would be brighter than noonday. Darkness would be like the morning. And then you would trust because there is hope. And you would look around and rest securely. You would lie down and none would disturb you, and many would flatter you. But the eyes of the wicked will fail, and there will be no escape for them, and their hope is to breathe their last. Now, again, we are only looking at the very first speeches, and not all of it, of these three friends, Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad. This is just a sampling of what of the type of talk that they have with Job. Read all of them. I would encourage you, because it's important to take all this in context. All right, let's summarize Zophar. Good old Zophar. Gotta love him. Zophar was your typical legalist. He assumed that everything must have a cause and effect. He suggested that even God himself is bound by laws, and if so, and here it comes again, Job was suffering from some great sin. Sounds familiar? What is the bottom line here? There's a valuable lesson to be learned from the attempt of these three so-called friends of Job. First, remember this, guys. Bad things do happen to good people. Remember that we live in a world that is under the curse of sin. It is an imperfect world. We have no guarantee from God's word that if we live godly lives, we will never know grief. Yes, Job's situation was very unique. And there was not only a purpose for it, but thankfully for Job, a beautiful conclusion. Second, you and I, and this is probably the most important thing, pay close attention. You and I do not know exactly what is going on inside of the heart of those who are hurting around us. So let's not pretend that we do. Job's friends were obviously clueless to his unique situation. Yet, they automatically assumed that what they perceived to be the problem and the solution. And that is a big problem. Never, never shall we assume that we know what someone's situation is, and we should never assume what the conclusion or what the solution of that problem is. As I said at the beginning of the lesson, sometimes the best thing we can do is, when someone's hurting, just simply be there with them. You know, there's a lot of lessons about the tongue and the problems with the tongue. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just zip it up. Don't say a word. In her book, Free Fall, author Rhonda Robinson, a mother of 9, lost her 13-year-old son Danny in a terrible car accident. She talks about the platitudes that people often use to attempt to comfort her during this time. She lists some of those platitudes and how they personally impacted her. Often, when we really don't know just what to say to people who are hurting, we come up with phrases like, well, there's a reason for everything, or it was God's will. Really? Is that the best that we can come up with? We would be better just to keep our mouths closed and not even to say such shallow platitudes at all. In her book, Rhonda Robinson talks about how those platitudes impacted her and how really shallow some of those things were. Coming from good intentions, yes. Coming from people who meant nothing but her good, but unfortunately caught up in their own shallowness, not knowing her situation. How in the world can they even understand what it was like to suffer what she was suffering? Those platitudes hit her like a ton of bricks. They missed the mark. Well, maybe there's some truth in some of those words, those platitudes, but is it really what that person really needed to hear right then and there? The point is, sometimes, actually most of the times, because we really don't know what someone is going through, the best thing that we can do is to sit with them and be silent. Thank you for listening.